Welcome to the Virginia is for Laughers podcast, brought to you by the funny Womax and Friends. If you're looking to get more out of your Shenandoah Valley experience, then this is the podcast for you. You'll meet interesting people, musicians, and comedians that perform here and find out more about what you can do and see. Whether you live here or plan to visit, listen to explore what makes our unique slice of heaven. Now here's your host, Don Davis Womack.
Hello, Laughers. I'm so excited to have here another expert in health and fitness in the continuation of our health and fitness series this month. Today, we have Dr. Mike Saunders, director of the Human Performance Laboratory, where we are at James Madison University. He is an exercise science professor and researcher who specializes in endurance, performance, and recovery. It is super exciting to have you here today. He's going to share with us some of his story, how he landed here, his expertise, and his top 5 tips for you in health and fitness. Welcome to the show, Mike. It's great to have you on today.
Thank you for having me, Don. I appreciate it.
Yeah, this is so exciting. This is not maybe a known fact, probably for students here at JMU, but probably a lot of our guests don't know that you come from Canada, born and raised.
That is correct. I think my students figure it out as soon as I say out and about.
That is a dead giveaway, isn't it?
Yep. 20 some odd years and still can't get rid of it.
Some things stick with us. And before we recorded, I actually just learned, and I've known you for some years now, that your parents were born and raised in England.
That's correct. Yep. They came to Canada after they got married, and then all of my immediate family lives in Canada still.
That's incredible. So I think we should start there. How does one grow up in Canada and end up in the United States, James Madison University, teaching kinesiology? How does this happen?
Yeah, it's a bit of a interesting path. I was a competitive distance runner, started running started running a little bit in my youth, but started getting more serious about it in high school. And once I realized that I had a little bit of talent, I realized that it could be a path towards getting an education. So I'm a first generation college student. And so it was pretty clear to me that I was going to have to pay for my own education. And so I was pretty hell-bent on trying to get an athletic scholarship so that I could actually afford to go to college. And so I was training hard towards that goal, but I had some issues with injuries and things like that. And so I was good enough to be considered for these scholarships, but I was not a superstar. And so I had a fair bit of interest from schools that were interested in me. But then when I got injured, all of that interest went away. And so I actually I missed the spring season of my senior year in track. And so I went into that summer after graduating high school without any offers, at least not any offers that I could have afforded. I had some small partial scholarship offers and things like that, but it was pretty clear that was not going to pan out. And so, I was working in a bottled water factory for $6 an hour, and I was basically going to be saving up as much money as I could, and then the goal was to continue to do that for another year so that I could potentially still be eligible for a scholarship.
Wow.
So I was on my feet in steel-toe shoes every day for 8 to 10 hours, and then I would train after work.
Oh my gosh.
And then
dedicated.
Yeah, I mean, it was just, that was something that I was sort of really serious about doing. And so what ended up happening was I'd had a contact with somebody at East Tennessee State University, but I had never really followed up with the coach because I knew they'd locked up all of their scholarship offers. Well, one of their top recruits ended up contacting them in early August to inform them that they had received the results from their most recent SAT, at which they had failed. They were not going to be eligible, and so they weren't coming. And so keep in mind, this is in the age before the internet. And so I got a call from this person that I knew, tried to find out whether I was in shape. And fortunately, I'd run a road race that week that confirmed that I was in good shape and everything. Yeah. And so they basically offered me a scholarship on the spot over the phone. I had never so much as seen a picture of the university, but I knew it had to be better than working in a bottled water factory for $6 an hour.
Yeah.
And so I said yes, and I hopped on a Greyhound bus and showed up at East Tennessee State, and the rest is history.
There are parts of this story, Laughers, I did not know. So I'm glad I asked the question. What did that feel like when you got that phone call?
Oh, it was the biggest reprieve. It was like, I mean, I had been obviously working for it. It was an opportunity that I was ready for.
Preparation.
But I did not think it was going to happen at that point. I thought I was going to have to be sort of in limbo and waiting and working for another year to try to save money. And so it was like somebody just handed me a
golden ticket.
It was
kind of.
very much so. And so, I mean, a lot of people talked, I don't know if I could have, sort of just up and left and not know where, but it was such a great opportunity relative to what I was sort of looking towards doing that year that, I had no misgivings about it at all. And we had a fantastic group of people and athletes and stuff down there. And so they made me feel at home almost immediately.
Great.
And so there was never a time when I got down there, I was like, oh my gosh, this is a good choice. It was obvious from day one that it was a good choice.
That's incredible. What is the timeline between getting that phone call and getting on the Greyhound bus?
10 days.
Okay. It sounded fast, but I just wanted to confirm.
Yeah, I think it may have even been less than that. I think the school year may have started in 10 days. I don't remember the exact details. It was over 30 years ago now, but it was no more than 10 days between phone call and hopping on the bus.
Had you ever been to America before?
Oh, yeah. I've been to America plenty of times. I don't know that I'd ever been to Tennessee.
Okay. So that was a whole new experience.
Yes. Yep.
And what did you run in Tennessee? What was your event?
I ran cross country and I ran the distance events, so 5,000 and 10,000 meters. I was definitely better at the longer stuff, so I considered myself a 10,000 meter runner in college. Okay.
So for those of us who don't run or do the math a lot, what does that mean miles-wise?
That is 6.2 miles.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
So
I figured you would know.
Yeah.
What were some of the highs during your collegiate career that you are fond of when you look back on that now?
On a team note, we had, like I said, East Tennessee had been a bit of a powerhouse in distance running back through the 70s and early 80s, and then they had sort of had a weaker phase. And I happened to be there at a time where they were sort of in a rebuilding phase, and there were some very good athletes there, but they had not qualified for the NCAA championships for, I think, a couple of years prior to getting there. And so I sort of became part of a younger group that all came up together. I certainly was not a superstar. I was most often probably the fifth runner on our cross country team. But
what does that mean, like fifth runner?
Yeah, so you can, when you run cross country, it is a team event, and so you can field 7 runners, and they score the top 5 of them. And so basically everybody is running as an individual, but you want to get in the lowest score possible because the lowest score wins. And so,
what does lowest score mean? Like getting the distance done in the shortest amount of time?
And in cross country, it's your place. And so if you come first, you have a score of 1.
Okay, I'm learning more about cross country. I didn't know.
And so the higher up you finish, that is how you calculate the team score. And so, like, we had a runner who was exceptional. He was a 6-time All-American. And so if he won the race, he has a team score of 1. And so then it's okay. Whereas our second runner finishing, and then you add up the score of all 5 of those individuals, and that's your team score.
Okay, so you're definitely a utility player for sure.
Yeah, so if I was a basketball player, I was in the starting lineup, but I was not the person signing all the autographs.
I like the way you put that. So what would be a stellar, your daughter runs cross country to see how DNA works. She is a phenom, Brooke, right?
She is, she's done quite well. She's 10th grade now, and she's also taken up running. My wife, we met in college. She was also a 10,000 meter runner. And so now our daughter has also taken up running, and she's off to quite a good start in her high school career.
I think so. So what is like a great team score if you're in cross country world, you're in that world, and you hear this number, you're like, whoa, wow, that's amazing. What would be an amazing score?
So I'm going to get this wrong here, but the perfect team score for 5 runners would be first, second, third, fourth, and fifth. And so that would be 9 plus 3 is 12 plus 15. 15 is a perfect score.
Oh, wow. Does anybody ever get that?
On occasion, but it's very rare.
Okay.
So you asked about my college highlights. So we had a bit of a difficult first year as a team. My second year, we managed to win the conference title with a team score of 20.
Wow,
so if perfect
okay.
score is 15 and we had 20, you can tell that was... so all 5 of us, we had some injury problems, so we only had 5 on the line. So everybody had to do well, and all 5 of us made the all-conference team.
That'd be pretty exciting. So that was definitely a high.
That was definitely a high. And then the following couple of years, I had an injury where I missed a year, but ultimately our team was able to get back to, we won the regional, not only the conference, but the regional championship, and we're ranked in the top 10 in the country the last couple of years I was there. And again, I was a very small part of that success.
But you're still a part of it.
Yeah,
every part counts.
Yeah, and you get to see what I was never able to quite develop to the level that I had hoped that I would, but being around athletes of that caliber, you get a sense of truly what it takes to be at that level, and I got a chance to give it a shot, and it didn't go as well as maybe I would have hoped in a perfect world, but I don't regret any of it for a second. It led to a lot of great friendships, a lot of awesome opportunities, and I met my wife while I was there as well.
That's
so
right.
It was a really great opportunity.
And you have 2 children.
I do. Yep.
Yeah, and the other one's, the older one, Aiden, has been playing soccer.
That's correct. Yeah, so he's enjoyed soccer since he was a little kid, and has been playing travel soccer since he was about 10, and then has played the last 2 years as a Division III college player at Ferrum College.
Okay, this is a great segue into this question. We had talked about this a little bit before we recorded, and see if it would come to this, but I am very curious, having this, you and your wife, this endurance background, as athletes yourself, how has that influenced your coaching at home, if you will, for your kids?
Yeah,
and do they want to hear it?
That's a great question. You have to ask them about the latter part, but I do think it informs the way that you live. And I think a lot of it is just learning by example. I mean, both of my kids growing up, my wife and I have continued to be pretty dedicated exercisers throughout our entire life. And in fact, for a good part of the time when my kids were young, particularly when Aiden was young, my wife is still even competing at a pretty high level. And so they would see, just the habits that come if you want to be fit, if you want to be training, and certainly if you want to be competitive, you have to work hard. And so they would see us, building our days around our training and making the sacrifices that are necessary to do that. Bring a bike on vacation and things like that so that you can stay training and things like that. And so I think some of it is just they absorb a lot of the habits just by
role modeling.
And so I don't think there was a lot of lecturing about this type of stuff, but they see those habits.
Actions.
And then they also we have their perspectives when they would face inevitable things that come up. We can talk to them about our own experiences and things that we've seen, and it's also informed, the way that we would like for them to view it, because my wife and I both came up in distance running, particularly for young women. It's a very weight-focused sport because all things equal, being lighter is an advantage because it's not as much energy to carry around a lighter mass. But as a result of that, it can sometimes lead to
eating disorders
and just other perfectionist type tendencies that can be helpful in small amounts and harmful in large amounts. And so those types of experiences, we've seen them firsthand. We've both always had very good and I think healthy attitude towards exercise and food and things like that. And so we tried to pass those things on and try to also not overemphasize, the result. It's got to be more about the process. And at the end of the day, if they're not enjoying the process, nobody's forcing them to stay in the sport. And so we've tried to have a good balance of, we know the discipline and the hard work that it takes, but we also know that, it's running or athletics is a very small part of who you are, and it should be something that accentuates your life, not becomes, sort of
a burden.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. And so I think your experiences, if I'm hearing you right, you saw in your own selves maybe places during your own development where you can find more enjoyment in doing what you're passionate about doing and that experience has influenced how you've talked to your children about
For sure.
finding enjoyment.
Yeah. And we've also seen individuals who, I don't know if this is the right way to phrase it, but they weren't in it for the right reason. So and so they were doing it to serve some role in their life, but it clearly was having harmful effects rather than positive ones. It was almost like having, being an addict to the activity or something like that. And so yeah, I think in our own lives, we have found exercise and competition to be a largely positive thing that's had all sorts of really enjoyable and exciting elements to our life, but we've also seen the other side of it. And, I've had plenty of overuse injuries and things like that, and I don't think it's because I did anything, insane or anything like that, but that comes with the territory as well, and you have to be willing to accept them and consider how that affects your role. And so, I mean, when you become dedicated to something as an athlete, it becomes a bit of your identity. And so you have to just keep those things in balance, because if you can't train for some reason, you don't want to lose who you are. So
that's all very important lessons. I think that can be transferable to other parts of people's lives.
For sure.
As well. So I like that. We are in the Human Performance Laboratory, of which you are the director.
That's right.
Yes, congratulations for that title, by the way. This is a different part of the laboratory, Laughers, from the first episode of the series with Dr. Chris Womack, my husband, the other funny Womack. We are now in the back part of this laboratory where the endurance testing takes place. And I would love if you could just talk a little bit about, in general, the overall mission of the laboratory and what kinds of projects and research you do in here, just so people have a general sense of what you do.
Yeah, so our laboratory actually serves all of the exercise science faculty in our department, and so it's not especially narrow in its focus. And so we have 5 or 6 exercise science faculty that all have their own individual research lines, and they vary from to being very sort of health-oriented to being more competitively focused, which is sort of more my area of interest. So there's a wide variety of things, all incorporated under the umbrella of exercise and its effects on a variety of different things. And so my own area of emphasis has been more on looking at, for the most part, short-term nutritional modifications that can either enhance performance in the moment or that can influence recovery. And so I don't approach this like a dietitian. I'm not a dietitian. I approach this more like an exercise physiologist, which is, I'm not going to micromanage all the things that you're looking at in your diet. My questions are more around things like, if you want to run a competitive marathon, are there food and drink that you can be consuming during the event, like sports drinks and things like that could enhance your performance? So what's the role of carbohydrate? How much carbohydrate? What types of carbohydrate? Should you be consuming caffeine, et cetera, et cetera? So there's a lot of questions around the things that you can be using either before or during exercise or immediately following it in terms of its effect on the recovery of those athletes as well. So things like refueling with some carbohydrate, having some protein in there to help with muscle rebuilding and adaptation, and then rehydration and things like that. And so really that sort of encompasses the vast majority of the work that I've been doing over the last 20 years, topics related to those things.
Now that is really fascinating to me. So the endurance athletes that you test in here are recreational athletes and or sports athletes here at JMU, or both?
For the most part, and there are some exceptions to this, we don't work directly with the JMU athletes because they're usually, if they're in season, it's very disruptive for us to be able to do some sort of scientific intervention into their study.
Oh, that makes total sense. Yeah,
so it's a very difficult thing to do. There have been some instances where there's been reasons why coaches may want some testing of their athletes.
See where they are.
And we have some limited capacity to do that. We're certainly not set up to be, testing the entire football or basketball team and running them through this. But if it's something that we can tie into like a research study or something like that, which I've worked with a number of groups of individuals. And so to sort of more directly answer your question, we're not working for the most part with JMU athletes, but we do often test athletes. And again, this is more in my own work. It's mostly around, because it's so athletically focused, we're usually dealing with competitive recreational athletes all the way up to, I've worked with probably a dozen professional cyclists and high-level runners and other endurance athletes that they're very interested in some of the work that we do because it's sort of a mutually beneficial situation. Is we can bring them in here and do some testing that could be scientifically interesting, but then they're getting data that can be helpful for them in their training and things like that. And so I have I don't know that, I mean, I have a skill set and a background where I know quite a lot about the science, but I'm also very familiar with the application. And so for groups of people that are trying to use the data in a way that is helpful and useful in their training, that's where I'm maybe most useful to folks in that type of environment. So, but as a laboratory, we run the gamut. Exercise is helpful and beneficial for everyone.
True that.
And so we deal with people who are on the very sort of lower end, trying to get into exercise and
or get back. That's my case.
Very much so. So what are the benefits and what types and amounts of exercise are helpful? What types of advantages come from that? But again, my emphasis, because of my backgrounds and interests, has mostly emphasized more the competitive element of that. But I'll be the first to acknowledge that perhaps the group that exercise can benefit the most are the people that are doing the least.
That's true. Well, you would see, my background before I did all of this was in exercise science, and that would be a sharper contrast. For sure, I would feel like someone either getting back into it or getting started versus the athletes already in shape and making those
the
elite adjustments, basically. The
interventions that I'm trying to do, then if I could improve somebody's physical performance by 3%, that's a home run. Whereas if you take a non-exerciser and get them to exercise, you could increase their capacity by 50%.
That's incredible,
so it's admittedly, I'm taking the fittest group of the population and trying to help them perform a little bit more.
And they want that.
They value it.
Absolutely.
As I did at that stage of the game myself. So
I love that you bring your personal background and your own collegiate experience into the work that you do now as a professional. That's super exciting to me. And now we're talking about a 2-decade difference, right? From when you were actually competing, or even maybe a little longer, to today?
Yeah.
Is that the difference?
For the most part,
roughly?
I competed in my teens and as a runner all the way up into my mid-20s. And then eventually I got out of competitive running just because, as I mentioned, I had a lot of overuse injuries and things like that. And it was becoming obvious that I was not going to continue to develop. I had some reasonable performances. I mean, I ran one half marathon, and so I like to joke with people that, and this is true, but it's a distortion of the truth.
Right.
The slowest half marathon I ever ran was 67 minutes because I only ever ran one. And so I think if I'd been able to stay healthier, those longer distances, the half marathon and the marathon were where I was going to be the most successful. But by that point, I had too many issues that were going to prevent me from training and developing the way I wanted to. So at that point, I sort of pivoted a bit, and I got into cycling during a long period of recovery. And then at that point, I started enjoying cycling enough that I dabbled in a little bit of mountain bike racing, and then I got into racing duathlons and triathlons. And then at some point in my late 30s, I just abandoned all running activities because I just kept getting injuries and stuff. And so I've become more of I guess you'd call it a competitively recreational rider, meaning I don't actually race very much, but I still like to stay very fit and push myself and do hard, fun things on the bike, but not from a competitive standpoint anymore. So I have not really, I would say I competed semi-seriously through into my mid-30s, but to your point, I'm going to be 55 in 2 weeks. So that's 20 years ago since I was ever
really active in that realm.
I mean, when I was at that stage of my life, on a day like today when it's freezing cold and it's icy outside and I was supposed to do an 80-mile bike ride,
do it?
I would do an 80-mile bike ride on an indoor trainer.
Oh my goodness.
Now I like to use what I call the Weather Channel training program, which is
what is that?
I look at what the weather's going to be like, and if there's a day that I'm supposed to do a long ride this week, it will be on the warmest day where the conditions are the best. And I don't have specific objectives that I'm training for other than to stay fit and healthy and maintain a high level of function. So it doesn't matter what day, and I can afford to be flexible. So I am.
Yeah, that is really interesting. Now, you were I'm curious about the nutritional strategies you used personally when you were active in that, and then how different that is from what you've learned over the years and what you would recommend to somebody now. Or is it the same, or is it a hybrid? What does it look like?
Yeah, I think a hybrid's probably a good way to put it. I mean,
Okay.
When I was competing, so the last, I guess it depends a little bit on the events that you're doing. But for example, when I ran the half marathon event, which is a running event that lasts over an hour, I would consume almost no water.
Really?
And
Was that a thing back then?
I should clarify that because
Okay.
the conditions were not, when I did that, the conditions were not so hot that I had to worry that much about it. And because I was going to be finishing in a little over an hour, I knew I was not going to be getting dangerously dehydrated. And so I may have taken a few sips along the way, but I knew, first of all, I was not going to get dehydrated, and so there's very little advantage to consuming water.
I see.
And then second of all, I was afraid that I was going to get stomach cramps and things like that by trying to consume a lot of water by running at a fast pace. And I wouldn't have even thought about consuming carbohydrate because the mentality back then in the early 90s was there's probably very little advantage to doing that in any event that was less than about 2 hours. We now know that that's not entirely true. And so if I was competing in some of those same events now, I probably would have experimented more with some carbohydrate intake strategies during the event. And without going off the rails with the details here, we now know that in events of about that length, if you're exposing yourself to some regular intake of carbohydrate, it doesn't need to be much, but just the presence of carbohydrate reaching your mouth sends a signal to your brain that lets it know food is coming, and it can release some of the inhibition that your brain might otherwise be sending to your muscles. And so
Interesting.
And so I would have purposely had a regular strategy of just taking a little swig of carbohydrate at each of the aid stations instead of avoiding them at that point.
What does that carbohydrate intake look like for those of laughers out there that just haven't gotten into endurance competing even on a recreational level or just doing it? What does that look like? It's been a while since I did marathon training, but their goos come in little packets that can give you that carbohydrate
That's
intake.
right.
And what other things are there
The
available?
most common in running events would be the gel packets.
The
that you're
gel
talking
packets.
about.
Thank you so much.
Goo is one of the commercial
good. I
gel
remembered.
packets that they have. So that's correct. So gel packets and then just carbohydrate drinks. I mean, the most common being ones like Gatorade and Powerade, but there's all sorts of concoctions now in terms of aiming to get the right types and amount of carbohydrate. And so there's a lot of subtle differences between the different drinks that you can get. And so, and it would take a while to get into the nuances of the how and the why. The short answer would be the longer you're going. So if you're doing something that is 2 hours or longer, the potential benefits of carbohydrate can be sizable because carbohydrate is the primary fuel that your body is using during events like that.
Right.
And the reality is we can run out of our body's stored or endogenous carbohydrates within a single event. And so particularly when I got into cycling, and this is where a lot of my interest in these areas came up, is because as I transitioned from being a runner, where almost all of my events were under an hour, carbohydrate maybe can be somewhat beneficial, but only to a small degree. Once you go much longer, and most cycling events are well over 2 hours and sometimes 5-6 hours in length, your body does not have enough stored carbohydrate to get you to the finish. And so what you're consuming during an event like that can have a huge implications in terms of your performance. And so that's where I really started experimenting on my own with the things that we were testing in the laboratory. So I figured out pretty quickly that if you try to go out for a 3-hour bike ride and go hard and you're only consuming water, you are going to fall apart. And
really?
So,
you experienced that?
Oh, I've experienced it. Very, very much so. Yeah, it's not a pleasant feeling.
I bet.
Runners call it hitting the wall. Cyclists call it bonking. But whatever you call it, it sucks. It's you go for much of it. You feel like you're doing just great.
Yeah.
And then once your body can no longer provide you with the carbohydrate fuel that you need, and some people also they become hypoglycemic at that point, and so everything goes from feeling just fine to feeling miserable quite quickly.
Wow. So you have an experience while you were out training that was dire, or?
I wouldn't call it dire. I would call it more typical for which is you just the same effort and speed and power output that you were just chugging along and feeling good and confident all of a sudden becomes
just goes away.
A bit like a death march until you get to the finish. And the good news is it's solved almost immediately as soon as you get some carbohydrate.
That's incredible.
One of the stories I tell my students about this was when I was a doctoral student, I went for a mountain bike ride that was supposed to be 2 hours long, and I was pacing myself for a 2-hour effort. But the directions were poor, and I realized after I had gone out a couple of hours that there was no way I was going to find what the turnoff that made it into a loop. So I basically had to come back the way I came.
Oh, so that's another 2 hours back.
And so somewhere about 2.5 to 3 hours in, I bonked, and it was a miserable last hour. But when I got back to my car, my office mate had actually made us a loaf of chocolate chip banana bread, and it just happened to be sitting in the passenger seat. And I just sat there and ate an entire loaf of chocolate chip banana bread sitting in a vacant parking lot in the hills of Tennessee, and felt better almost immediately.
I was going to say, you must have felt so much better.
Yes, yeah. It was, to this day, it's one of the most memorable meals I've ever had.
Okay. So how do you coach, or do you coach? You're doing research. So do you do any coaching about nutritional strategies at all?
I've dabbled in it a little bit. I've dabbled with, I did a little bit of coaching of some runners, cyclists, and multi-sport athletes, and like duathlon and triathlon. And then in terms of, I don't do nutritional coaching because, like I said, I'm not a sports dietitian or a nutritionist or anything like that. So it's more just, I will sometimes give talks to groups of people as it relates to just, here's what we know about things like what can you do before, during, or after exercise that can enhance your performance. And so one of the groups that I work with is, you may have heard of the Miller School of Albemarle.
I have not. Please tell me about it.
It's a private residential high school outside of Charlottesville.
Oh.
And so they have created a bit of a niche there where they've created a very, very competitive, like a nationally competitive cycling program, and they have athletes from all over the country, and in fact from multiple countries.
Multiple countries.
Yeah. So they are.
This is a gym.
It's a beautiful campus. They even have mountain bike trails on their campus, and so they have athletes that are trained at a very high level by good quality coaches. It's even there are aspects of it that are built into their curriculum. And so these are athletes that in many cases, they run the gamut from sort of recreational beginners, but all the way up to international class junior athletes. And so I work with them, and we'll go down usually once or twice a year and do some short talks and things like that, just to give them, up-to-date information on the right type of science. And we also will sometimes bring some of their athletes up here for some physiological testing so they can figure out their aerobic capacity, lactate threshold, and things like that.
That's really, how did you find out about them?
One of their athletes a number of years ago, because I mentioned that my particular skill set is useful to a certain type of person. And that type of person is most often a highly committed, competitive endurance athlete.
All right.
And so I guess I developed enough of a reputation within this area where if you want data and you want to understand your data, you should really talk
to Dr.
Saunders. And so they had an athlete who was transitioning from competing at the high school level and was some professional teams were interested in working with him, and they wanted some data to support all of that. And so I think somebody that had been tested in our lab and that I'd worked with before had sort of referred them to me, and we, from that point, sort of established a relationship, and I think it's been a really beneficial one. And we've even done some research studies with their athletes over the years as well, because they're a really unique group where you have this unusually large cluster of very young, very talented individuals with really high aerobic capacities. And there's very, very little data out there on young, highly competitive athletes. And so we've been able to give them a lot of interesting data. And at the same time, that data is interesting scientifically because there's just so little information about, well, how are they different from their, fully mature 25-year-old, professional counterparts and things like that.
That's amazing. So has there been any surprising findings in this research at all, or just interesting facts that people didn't know before as a result of this research?
So one area that we looked at was, so one of my colleagues, Stephanie Curdy-Luden,
She's just somebody else I should talk to.
I absolutely agree.
Okay.
And so one of the areas that she specializes in is in pulmonary and respiratory function, which is an area that we haven't given a lot of attention to in our lab prior to her joining our faculty 7 or 8 years ago. And so the traditional view of, what is it? So we think about, everybody has an aerobic capacity. We call it their VO2 max. And so endurance athletes have very high aerobic capacities. So whatever your aerobic capacity is, there's something that prevents it from being higher. And so for most people, it's how much blood can your heart pump out and how much oxygen is carried in that blood. And traditionally, the viewpoint has been, the lung is overbuilt and it can oxygenate all of that blood just fine as long as it's getting enough blood.
Got it.
But there are some groups of individuals, particularly those with really high heart capacities, like endurance athletes, that might actually be creating an environment where the lung becomes the limiting factor.
Interesting.
And so you don't have to feel bad. This is not like a disorder or anything. It's more just that if your heart capacity and your oxygen carrying capacity is exceedingly high, well, something else might become the limiter now.
Yeah.
And so there was some evidence that this can be the case in people with really high aerobic capacities. It can also be true in smaller individuals. Well, when you're talking about teenage cyclists with really high aerobic capacities, they check a number of those boxes. And if you're talking about women, they tend to be physically smaller as well. Now they check a third of those boxes. So one of the things that we did in collaboration with Dr. Curdy was, when we were bringing all these athletes in for their aerobic capacity testing, we did some pulmonary testing on them to figure out, is there any evidence that their aerobic capacity is being limited by their lung function as opposed to the traditional, oxygen carrying capacity. And what we found was they were disproportionately higher, their lung limitations were disproportionately higher than people with more average aerobic capacity. So it wasn't a shocking finding because but it was very difficult to get access to a large enough number of people who were young with massive aerobic capacities to be able to sort of prove what people might have suspected based on logic and intuition. So that was a really cool finding.
And that's utilizing the athletes from this Miller, what was the name of it?
Miller School of Albemarle, yeah. So they were I think they were almost all of so we had to have a control group of people with fairly typical aerobic capacities, and then we needed a group of people with absurdly high aerobic capacities, and the Miller School athletes were almost all, if not all, of our absurdly high group.
Yes, it sounds like they would be.
Yeah.
What are some of the surprising findings, or to you the most notable findings about this nutritional strategies research that you've been doing?
There's been a number of them over the years. I think one of them relates back to the comment that I made about carbohydrate. When you start to eat it, we've found that there's actually receptors that can detect the presence of carbohydrate in the mouth, and that provides feedback to the brain. And the brain is really the regulator of everything, right? And so the brain is what sends the signal to your muscles that tells it to contract and to go. But if the brain thinks that perhaps there's a fuel shortage on the way because you're using up all of this carbohydrate, then it may be inhibiting the strength of that signal. In other words, it's not giving you an all systems go to be able to go as hard as you want, because it's preventing you from failing at some point in the future. And so the concept is that simply by having carbohydrate, the potential benefit for performance is that before it even gets digested and influences your blood glucose or is sent to the muscle as a fuel, it may actually be influencing your performance because your brain is detecting its presence. And so there was a study that came out on that back in about 2004 that demonstrated that fact by basically having people just, instead of drinking carbohydrate, they swish some of it around in their mouth and spit it out.
I was reading you were doing that a little bit. Yeah, tell me more.
So they call it just carbohydrate mouth rinsing. So there's no benefit to spitting it out. The only reason they had them spit it out was as a experimental model, right? Which is if you swallow it, well, then now it's going to get digested. It's going to affect your blood glucose. It's eventually going to reach the muscle to be used. So if we haven't spit it out, then now we know that it's not affecting anything other than what happened in the oral cavity. And so other researchers from England published a study on that back in 2004. And when I first read it, my initial gut reaction was, this is a fluke. It's not going to be
Really?
Once I read the paper fully, you could see that it had a premise to it that could make sense, and that, wow, this is really interesting. And so, not surprisingly, many other researchers, including ourselves, did variations of that particular research, and sure enough, it turned out to be highly reproducible, and we've reproduced it in our own lab as well. So to me, that was a finding that was really, really interesting. I mean, for me, when I was a student, this is, I guess, looping back to your early questions about how I got started. I had no idea what I wanted to be. Like I said, I was a first-generation college student.
Yep.
I knew I liked the area of kinesiology. I'd studied it some in high school, so I knew I liked the area, but the only careers that I knew of were physical education teacher and physical therapist. And I was pretty sure that I didn't want to do either of those things. I'd had a little exposure to both and decided that it probably wasn't for me. So I was pursuing this area that I was interested in, but I really didn't know what I wanted. And it wasn't until I was a junior, I was taking an exercise physiology class. And I had this very animated and excellent professor that was teaching it. And one day the penny sort of dropped, which is, I want his job.
It clicked.
Yeah. And the reason I bring that up is because one of the things that really fascinated me in that class was he was talking about some of the current research at that time in the early 90s, looking at the effects of carbohydrate and its beneficial effects as a fuel. So some of the stuff I mentioned earlier, where if you give a marathoner who's out there for 2+ hours, if they're consuming some carbohydrate, they're providing supplemental fuel that will actually help their performance. And so he was explaining some of these really cool studies from the early 90s. And I remember thinking to myself, wow, that is so awesome. What a shame that all the interesting studies in this area have already been done. And then it turns out that I would end up spending 20 years doing it, and here it is 2025 now, and we're still learning lots of new things
and doing new research that wasn't done then.
Yeah, so that's been really cool.
Yeah, I love that so much.
I also have to say one of the really cool findings that we had, and one of the highlights was work that we did with your husband.
What?
And so I'm sure you've heard the story before. Maybe he's too modest to share it.
Sometimes it can be, yeah.
So there was research that had been done in around the time just before he joined our faculty, where they had been looking at essentially a minor genetic modification that influences whether you are a fast or a slow caffeine oxidizer in your liver.
Yes,
so when
he
you
has talked
consume
about
drugs like caffeine, there are some things that will allow it to be processed very quickly or slowly. And it turns out that this is largely influenced by just one tiny little genetic modification. And so Chris had more of a background in some of the clinical and quasi-clinical applications of that. And so they were looking at how that might be related to cardiovascular disease and other things. But he and I were talking, and he was proposing that maybe this is why some people tend to be big responders to caffeine for performance, that it really augments their performance, and others not so much, which had been documented in the literature. And so using his background of the genetic work and also the applications of all of this, and then my expertise with how do we go about doing good performance testing in athletes, we ended up getting about 40 subjects to do a series of tests.
Yeah, I forgot that was that many.
Yeah, and so we did it with and without caffeine, and then we also figured out what their particular genotype was for this, and we established that sure enough, there was an effect where people who are fast or slow metabolizers of caffeine, it will influence whether or not you are a high responder or a more modest responder to caffeine. And that's an area that has gotten a lot of subsequent work, and it has been largely validated by a number of other pretty large studies since then. So that was a really cool finding, because to my knowledge,
he was super excited about that.
Yeah, I can't think of an earlier study that sort of showed a clear relation. Like, now you're essentially saying that you could determine a person's optimal nutritional environment or what they should be taking, and then that could be influenced by genetics. I can't think of a specific example of one that came before that. So it was pretty cool finding.
That is a really great finding. You have all of this background personally in fitness, endurance, athletes, yourself and in others in particular. I imagine, though, that also lends to some great advice for the rest of us, your everyday people, if you will. I wonder if you can give us some advice to the regular exercisers based on your background, just some general overview of that, and then we'll get into the top 5 tips.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, should I give you my tips? Because I think...
You think I'll answer the question?
I think so.
Oh, let's do it.
And we can, I guess, spin off of them from there. So,
okay. I love it.
I'm dictating terms here, I'm afraid.
It's okay with me.
So when you had asked about having some tips, and so I jotted a couple things down. So
I love it.
The first of those is just find your why. And that is, for a lot of people, exercise, it's hard to fit into people's lifestyles.
It's getting crazier.
And it can be really difficult too, in terms of when you're starting exercise, it's always hard. Because if you haven't done something for a long time, you're asking your body to do something that it's not accustomed to. And
it doesn't want to do it sometimes, I'm here to tell you, as someone getting back into it.
And I've had those experiences myself after long layoffs or surgeries and things like that. It is very, very difficult to get back. And it takes a long time to rebuild that. And so I think having a why for it makes a lot of difference. And when I say that, why do you even want to be active? And so for a lot of people, they have vague ideas about, maybe having lower body fat but I mean, it can go well beyond that. And I think one of the podcasts that I listen to is from a guy named Peter Attia.
Okay.
And he talks about what he calls the centenarian decathlon, which is more of a concept than anything else, which is simply that if you imagine yourself reaching 100 years of age, what would you like to be able to do? Because we all know that as you get older, and I mean, I'm 55 now, so I'm appreciating this more with every year and every decade, but our physical capacities decline.
So important to keep it up.
We all see this in the older people in our lives that we know. And so the ability to retain, and a lot of times it's not even improving, it's just holding on to or preventing the decline in a whole variety of
slowing it down.
Exactly. That's really all you're trying to do is slow down the rate of decline. To what end? And I think one of the things that he really talks about is if you find your why in all this, like I most of the things for me that I really enjoy doing have a physical component to them. I love being outdoors. I love doing things with my family that usually involve being outside. And
being active.
Yeah. And so the idea of being able to retain enough physical function.
To be able to do that.
Yeah. And not just now, but at 65
when the grandkids
and 75
come.
And beyond. And so that is where I think finding your why, and it's going to be different for everybody. I mean, I love the outdoors. Some people don't, but we know that exercise has so many benefits for health, for physical function,
sleep will improve.
The list goes on and on. Yeah, we could spend the next, your entire podcast just listing the things that exercise does. So finding your why helps that motivation for people to do it.
And what was the name of the podcast that Peter does? Just for those who want more information, we can, cross promote.
Peter Attia is his name, and I believe it's called The Drive.
The Drive, cool.
And he is a physician.
Shout out to Peter. Go Peter.
So there's a lot of very challenging stuff in there, but it's a mix. He has some very interesting people that he talks about that relates to exercise, and some of it is. I actually listened because I was being told that I might need to consider cholesterol medication. So I listened to a 5-part, 7-hour discussion of cholesterol metabolism there. So not every podcast is for everyone, but the ones where he talks about exercise, I think are quite useful as it relates to this. Yeah.
Good. So find your why. And I agree with you. I think at different stages of life, we have you will reimagine your why.
Yeah. And I think part of the reason why that's important is you want to build your program to fit your why. When I was 25, my why was because I wanted to be the best distance runner that I could be.
Yep.
And so everything about
Your
my
routine
exercise
is going to
program
look
was
really
around that.
different.
Whereas now, like I said, Weather Channel program, I can afford the flexibility, and I don't want to be, at this stage of the game, I don't want to be a specialist. I want to be a generalist. I want to be good at everything. And so I've always enjoyed endurance types of activities, and especially ones that get me outside. But I know that if I want to age well, the area that I need to really work on in addition to that is physical strength. And so even though I don't enjoy it as much, my program consists of a few days a week of getting in the gym and lifting heavy stuff. Because you need the aerobic component, but you also need the strength component. If you can retain both of those things into older age, you are going to physically age quite well.
Yes, we've been, with the other experts we've had on this series to date, the importance of strength and conditioning as you age has been pointed out, and I couldn't agree more. And the why will get you back to the gym. I think that's super important.
Because I think it's all about working backwards. If you know your
Yes.
why, where do I want to be? And then from
Begin with the end
if you
in
want
mind.
to be there, then what activities do I need to do?
How can I get there?
In order to be that person.
I love that. So that's top number one. You find the why.
We're going backwards here.
Oh,
That's
well.
number 5.
Oh, excuse me.
I don't think they're in any particular order.
Thank you for the correction, Dr. Saunders.
And so the next one, whether it's number 2 or number 4, depending on your perspective, is
just being a human out here giving everyone hope.
that's right. Is just to make it part of your lifestyle.
Oh, that's so huge.
And that, for most people, means it needs to be convenient, it needs to be simple, and it needs to be part of your day. Because if you're trying to force this thing that is exercise into an already busy lifestyle in a way that is unrealistic, then you're not going to do it. You're not.
That's
gonna stick
true.
with it. So it has to be something that fits into your day.
All right. So before we go any further, what would be your recommendation to best do that for people?
This is where, again, I think it's going to be different for everyone. And so you have to start by looking at your day. And this, I guess this dovetails into my next tip, which is find activities that you like enough that you will want to do them on a regular basis. So if we take those two things together, start with what does your lifestyle look like and what is it that you like to do? And then you have to find ways of fitting them together, and that sometimes that you can be creative with those things. So for example, because I'm less focused on a very specific outcome now, my program is a little bit more diverse. Now, because I'm getting older and because I've had 3 knee surgeries and a shoulder reconstruction, there's certain things that I can't do any running related activities anymore. I can't do a lot of swimming because of my shoulder reconstruction, but there's plenty of other things I can do. And
Like
so
hiking.
And so I've added hiking. I also, I had put off having our family get a dog for many years, in part because
I
was
remember
like,
this.
I am too busy,
Yeah.
and I know what's going to happen is I'm going to be the one that ends up having to take care of this dog.
Yeah.
And then eventually I caved, and we ended up getting a dog, and sure enough, who ended up being the person that's always walking the dog? This guy. But it also turns out that I love walking a dog. And because I was at a phase when we got that dog where I was coming back from a knee. I was quite limited at the time. For quite a while, for about 2 years, I was not able to do anything that I would call heavy training. And so that became one of my main
recovery exercises.
That became a big form of exercise. And throughout the pandemic, there was a year where me and that dog averaged 20,000 steps a day.
That's incredible.
For a year.
That's quite the pace.
Yeah, and so I don't do that quite as much anymore,
Yeah.
in part because I don't have to. I've been able to get back to some other things, but again, fitting it in your lifestyle. And one of the things that I think is challenging for people is they perceive there to be a lack of time. Well, you got 24 hours in your day. What you have to decide is how you spend that time. And so it can be challenging to fit those things in, but where can you fit it in? And so for me, the first thing I do when I get up in the morning, I let the dog out while I make my coffee. I have a little breakfast, and then I take the dog. So I've already taken the dog for a 3 or 4 mile walk this morning before I came in to see you. That's not the main part of my exercise program, but if nothing else, I've already got a good bit of physical activity, and physical activity from a health perspective and in terms of preventing that decline that we talked about, you don't have to be in a gym to get physical activity. And that's another thing that people, I think, they sort of feel like it doesn't count if you're not quantifying it, or if you're not in a gym. I mean, I've seen people drive around a parking lot to get a close parking spot to a gym and then go in and work out on a treadmill. Well, you don't need to be on a treadmill for it to count.
I might have been one of them. I would add to that too, is that especially someone who I have a background in it and have my own personal struggles and getting back into it, just not beating yourself up. If your plan was, I am going to squeeze in this 30, 40 minute exercise, whatever you've decided it's going to be today. And then today goes off the rails and now you just have 15 minutes. You can have the tendency to say, well, it's not going to be what I wanted it to be, and skip that 15 minutes that you have. I would just say take the 15 minutes because something is better than nothing, and not beat yourself up about it. Just be like, today went off the rails. I'm just going to do the 15 minutes because that's what I have today.
100%.
Yeah.
And then even beyond that, I think people have a tendency, let's say that they did miss a day. Well, now they maybe didn't meet their goals because their goal was to exercise 5 days this week.
Yeah.
So as a result of that quote unquote failure, now what's the point in doing anything?
Right. That all or nothing thinking.
Yes. And so I'm with you 100%. Be kind to yourself. Move on. There's always reasons why we can't.
Things happen. Life happens.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so doing the 15 minutes if you can, and if you miss a day, move on.
It's okay.
Tomorrow's a new day. And so
That's
let's try to meet tomorrow's goal, because there's like doing nothing or stopping this otherwise successful program is absolutely what you don't want to do. So don't let those don't make the losses in these little battles determine the war. Right?
That's right.
Is you have the opportunity to get right back out there and win the next day.
I agree with that. And every little bit in health and fitness in your own journey, it adds up over time. It's incredible.
That's one of the things I talk about in one of my broader classes with the undergraduates. And I tell them, I'm going to give you an exercise program in about a sentence. And it's the perfect exercise program, but nobody would ever buy it. And so then what I proceed to tell them is, if you could just do some of the things that we're talking about, in other words, regularly do some aerobic exercise and regularly do some strength conditioning work so that you are maintaining your endurance and that you're maintaining your muscular strength. Those two. So do enough that you just, and this is the part where no one's going to buy it, because I'm not telling you you're going to get better. I'm just going to give you enough exercise to stay where you are right now. But then what I tell them, because keep in mind these are 20-year-old college students, said if you could just exercise enough to stay at your current level, and then you come back for your 20-year reunion, you are going to be the champion of your 20-year reunion. And that's one of the problems with sort of the mentality, I think, that we tend to have as a public towards exercise, is that if you're not improving, then you're failing. And the reality is, to your point, it's about the little things that you do every day. And if you're just doing enough to maintain and to decelerate that inevitable decline that happens after a certain point in our lifespan, it's those little victories every day that add up to where by the time you get to middle age and beyond, the difference in your physical capacity, if you're doing any sort of regular physical activity, the benefits that has versus not doing it, they're immeasurable.
They are. You'll see it when you go back to your high school reunions, for sure.
That's right.
Yes, that can be eye-opening. Now we have two more. I don't know if we should say it's number 2 or number 1 or in reverse, but what's the next one?
So the next one is just think about what motivates you and incorporate those incentives into your program.
Okay, let's break that down a little bit more.
So there's a couple of examples. So for some people, exercise can be a really social thing. And so if what motivates you is, I'm going to get together with Dawn for a walk.
Right. Or a group exercise class.
Or whatever that is, meeting somebody at the gym. If that social component is what jazzes you up, then you should find a way to incorporate that in. With one caveat, don't select an exercise partner that you know is not very motivated, because then
For real,
then
that
you're
could
going
be
to
a
crash
problem.
and burn based on their inability to show up. But the broader point is if you like that social connection, if there's something about that really works for you, then use that as a motivator. Conversely, I personally find like I have a lot of social interaction in my day. I mean, there's 4 of us in our house, and then I come and do a job where I get a lot of social interaction. So for me, time by myself riding
It's
a
good for you.
bicycle outside, particularly when I can be in the outdoors, I find that incredibly renewing. And so going out there and doing a road ride or doing a hike in the forest or something like that, even if it's just myself or myself with the dog, that's time to myself that is, sort of something that I also value and appreciate and think. And if others want to join, I'd love that too. I'm a pretty social character. But,
I can attest.
but it might surprise you and some others to know that I do value that by myself time. It gives you time to think and reflect and things like that in a way that I find really valuable. And so that can be really good. And again, part of that's where the dog walking for me became a very useful thing at a time when I couldn't do most of the other activities that would get me outdoors and doing some of those things, just walking through the woods and things like that with the dog. The other thing that I did during that time, because I couldn't do other things, was I got a kayak and I started doing a lot more paddling. Because again, that was the motivator for me, that being in the outdoors and spending time doing physical things in nature is a huge motivator. Now, that's not true for everybody. And so that's where you have to reflect upon what is it that you like, what is it that you can incorporate into your program so that it's something that resonates with you.
Yeah, I think that's super important. There's so many ways to be active.
Yes.
And they have so many more modalities available than when we were in our 20s and 30s, because we're blessed to have very creative humans that have come up with new ways to be active.
And that's a great point, because the reality is it's much less important exactly what you're doing than you do something. The only caveat to that, I would say, is if possible, having something that emphasizes the endurance and aerobic part and something that emphasizes the muscular strength
and balance it out.
Yes. And if you can incorporate some of both of those, beyond that, the rest is just details. And the most important stuff is just find something that you can do and do it.
Yeah, and don't be afraid. I've said this before, and don't be afraid to change it. You can go down a road and think that is the greatest idea you ever had. Maybe it's picking up golf, and then you go do it, and you're like, I hate this.
Yeah, or maybe you love it for a while, and
then it
you
changes
wanna move on to
into something else.
That's right.
It's okay. The point is to find what you like and be okay with that shifting and changing within that season of your life. Or maybe in your 20s you liked, I don't know, cycling and you loved it, but now you're in your 50s and you're like, you know what, I'm done with the bike. It's walking now for me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and sometimes your body will dictate that. I mean, like I said, I spent over a decade running a lot, and I do zero running now. And if I had my choice, I would love to still be able to run, but I need to move on to that if I want to stay healthy. And so being adaptable is part
adaptable.
of the equation too.
I think that's the word we were looking for. So what is the number one?
Number one.
We're going like this. Number one is...
And this is something I like to also joke with my students about is it's okay to be a contrarian.
Whoa. Why? Okay, first of all, contrarian. Let's make sure we're all on the same page about what that is, and now why.
So contrarian is just somebody that is okay to not just fall into the mainstream of doing the norm.
Oh, I like this.
Okay?
Yeah.
And so part of the reason I say it's okay to be a contrarian, and I give them a good few examples of why I am such a contrarian as it relates to exercise, is if you think about our current culture has evolved in a way, for good reason, that there are very few opportunities to be physically active, and there are many opportunities. There's an excess availability of nutritional intake. In other words, we're surrounded by food and calories for intake, and the opportunities to burn those calories through physical activities have shrunk. And I think, again, there's good reasons for that. Is it makes perfect sense for us as a species to seek out high calorie foods, and because that was part of our survival not so many generations ago. Is if there were high calorie foods available, we should consume them. And so our bodies like
daily
these
we were
calories.
way more physically active. We had to grow our own food before we could eat our own food.
And because we were so physically active, when we had the opportunities to be sedentary and to sit around and do nothing, we should take them, because they were essentially a reward and an opportunity to rest up before the next time where we're going to have to be active in order to acquire our food. And so everything about a desire to eat more and eat what we now think of as poorly and to do very little physical activity, it all makes perfect sense in terms of a survival standpoint of our species. The problem is, because of the way our culture has evolved, this is not good for us. Our bodies are designed to be active, and when we're not active, they fall apart. And we're also not designed to overconsume calories in the way that we have as well. So my point is, and gets back to the contrarian piece, our cultural environment has changed in a way that if you want to be fit, you have to be fighting against the current.
That's true. And not only that, but the nutritional density in our foods is, with processed foods, is a direct impact too on what we consume.
So if you are just doing what the culture has sort of dictated, then you're almost certainly doing harm to your body.
That's correct.
And so this is where being a contrarian is useful. And it's hard. It means that you are doing things that are against, so paying attention to your portion control, finding ways to build in exercise.
Eating more whole foods.
Yeah. And so there are a number of things where, and I give the students a couple of examples, like, for example, we live in an area of town where our property is covered by trees, and so in the fall we get these massive dump of leaves and things like that, and so everybody's out there with their gas leaf blowers and things like that. I do almost all of my leaf gathering by hand with a rake, and the reason
what a simple choice.
And it's 4 times each fall. That takes about 4 or 5 hours each time. And one of the things that I found, it doesn't take any more time with a rake than it does with a leaf blower. It's just way more work. And it's just one little example of something where we have all of these work-reducing, energy-reducing devices that whenever I can, I try to reject them. Because, well, for example, same thing with, I had an opportunity to shovel snow with a snowblower the other day. I don't. I use the manual, and I was out there for 2 hours doing difficult physical manual labor, because if I'm going to be out there anyway, I might as well get the benefit from it. And those are fairly trivial examples, but I think there's a lot of things where you can do where there's, plenty of people who, particularly around the campus environment, you could walk to work. And in fact, one of the things I did to increase my physical activity when I was recovering, I started walking to work every day. It was 2 miles each way. And so even though I wasn't able to do much of what I would consider quote unquote exercise, I was getting 4 miles of physical activity in my day every day, even if I did nothing else throughout it. And then, people talk about how busy and challenging their lives are. Another simple thing like that I did was, when my son, as we mentioned, played a lot of club soccer and things like that. So you spend a lot of time bringing your kids to practices and to tournaments and things like that. And the practices would be 90 minutes long. And so during that, it's not quite long enough that you can go and do anything very productive during that time, because you have to get there. And so you can't drive all the way back. You'd spend almost the whole time in the car. So many parents end up finding themselves sort of stranded at some field somewhere without the ability to be very productive at work and things like that. And so what I would do during that time is, most of the time, I would just either bring my bike, and if the practice lasted for 90 minutes, I would do an 80-minute bike ride so that I was back in time for it. Or I would just walk loops around the field. And so that I wouldn't embarrass myself too badly, like, I would also build in some body weight type of
neat. Yeah.
push-ups and other things. But I would walk loops around the fields. And if you've got 90 minutes, I mean, I would walk 5+ miles, and then every time I got on the back end where I was further away from the other parents, I would drop and do push-ups or other types of things. So I was using that time that would have been very easy to be pulling out my phone and scrolling through social media and stuff like that. And again, it was just being a little bit of a contrarian, and you have to be, and this is where the point that I sort of try to make to the younger students, or maybe a little bit more conscious of what other people think, is that did some of the other people there maybe think I was a little bit of a lunatic? Quite possibly, but the beauty of being a contrarian is that you don't care.
I love that. And you can even start with smaller choices, I think,
100%.
too. Today, you listen to this podcast, and maybe you're on the way to the grocery store as you're listening to this podcast, and you can go, you know what, instead of getting the closest parking spot, I'm just going to park a little bit further, and now you're getting extra steps
100%
into the grocery store and on your way back out to the car.
I see people over at Harrisonburg Crossing driving to the different areas because they're going into more than one store. And again, why not park centrally and get extra? That's a very small thing, but those things add up a lot over the course of a day, and even more so over the course of a lifespan.
That's right. And if you're driving to work, you can do the same thing. Park a little bit further away from your place of work. And then also if you're working at home, just taking some consistent breaks throughout the day, maybe for lunch, before you have lunch at home, you can just, I'm going to take the dog out real quick, or I'm going to walk around the neighborhood once. It's just those small choices, they add up, and they encourage you and motivate you as you begin to do them to walk longer or take more breaks, or it becomes a habit to park a little further away.
That's a really great point, because there is a mindset too where, like, what if I can't go the whole way? Like in my case, it was 2 miles. Well, is that too much, either because of your physical capacity or just because of the amount of time that you have? But it doesn't have to be that. And so, like in my case, when I started doing that, and on the days I didn't have time, I would park over on the other side of Main Street, so that I would basically walk through the tunnel that goes into the quad. And so I would end up getting, maybe walking, 2/3 of a mile each way because I didn't have as much time, but I was still getting more than I would have otherwise. And by the way, it's a beautiful walk. So that's, again, from a motivational standpoint, instead of just driving from driveway to parking lot, I was actually able to walk through beautiful leafy campus and stuff. And it really didn't take me any more time. There wasn't a big cost of time in that particular event, because by the time I had waited at 3 other stoplights and found a place to park and got into the building, it probably wasn't taking me more. I was probably spending an extra 5 minutes in the process of doing that. So,
yeah, that's an important tip. Again, not beating ourselves up, but more loving ourselves through our fitness journey. I think that's so important. Too many of us beat ourselves up. Are there any trends today, shifting gears a little bit, fitness trends and or nutritional strategies that you're seeing happening that you maybe disagree with a bit?
I would just say broadly, that as it relates to exercise and nutrition, a lot of people think they're experts on those two things, because everybody moves their body and everybody eats. Therefore, everybody has some degree of expertise on that. And so I tell people, avoid the fads. Now, if there is a new form of exercise or something that works for you and that you like, by all means add it to your repertoire. But the basics, what we know about exercise and what we know about diet in terms of its effect on our body, the basics of them are relatively well known. And we also generally know the reasons why things have gone awry, if they have gone awry. And in the case of diet, what concerns a lot of people is weight loss, for example. Well, there's a lot of ways to consume nutrients in your diet. Whichever method you're using, if you're consuming more calories than you're expending, you'll be gaining weight. And so we need to start with basic principles, and then within those basic principles, find the specific diet or the specific exercise program that you enjoy enough that you're willing to stick with it. Because even if we could, like, there isn't some magical diet or magical exercise program that is all of a sudden going to give everybody the results they want and be easy, which are the two things that everybody wants. They want it to work, and they want to not have to work very hard at it if they can.
Like the miracle pills.
Yes, and the reality is they don't
things
exist.
that are happening.
And so my general recommendation to people is, if you're seeing something that's a little different, that excites you, or that gives you a reason to be interested in exercise, for example, by all means, I think of all of those things with nutrition and exercise. It's like another tool in the toolbox. It's just another opportunity to find something new that you can add to it. But the idea that somebody has now unlocked the secret and that all of our prior knowledge about exercise and nutrition was nonsense, that's somebody trying to sell you snake oil.
I agree. Absolutely. I think it's more about creating habits or renewing habits you once had, depending on what your story is, and new ways of being, basically.
I agree with that 100%. I listened to a different podcast about habits and time, and one of the things that they mentioned on there is that this person's perspective was they view time as fitting into one of three categories. You can either spend time, you can invest time, or you can waste time. And in the model that they talked about, spending time was when you get to do something that you really like. So, for example, if you get to go with your family on vacation, that is spending your time on something that you really enjoy. But then there's the investing time, and this is where you think about things like going to school or going to work, where maybe that isn't how you would choose to spend your time if you were given carte blanche, but you're there for a reason, because that time is being spent so that you can have the education or the money that you need to be able to do your life. So it allows you to then, you're investing that time so that you can then have more to spend. And then there's obviously the wasting part. And I think that this is where exercise, if you don't have the why that we talked about before, people can sometimes think of exercise as being almost the waste, when in reality, it is absolutely an investment in time. And if you find the right stuff, and this is why I tie in the enjoyment part, for me, exercise is not only investing time, but it's spending it. I actually enjoy doing it because I found the things that fit with my own motivators and interests and stuff like that. So for everybody, it is an investment in time so that your health and wellness and function is so much better. But if you find the right things, it can also be a spending of time.
That is a really wonderful take that I'm glad that you shared with us today. I'm sure that's going to benefit a lot of people thinking about it that way. We're getting ready to close up here, but I have a couple of final questions. One is, many people struggle to maintain motivation and consistency, and we are kind of talking about some strategies that people can start implementing. What do you think are the most effective strategies that help people stick to their fitness routines?
I don't know that there is any one. And the reason that I'm being so evasive on this is I think it goes back to my earlier, you have to find what works for yourself.
Really
and
what
so
it is.
I can absolutely share what motivates me.
I think that can be helpful.
But it's different for everybody. And so for me, because of my background as a competitor, and even though I don't compete anymore, I have always valued and still value the way that it feels to have a good functioning body. And so the ability to do physical tasks and to move through my day without a whole lot of effort, and to be able to go and do, like I said before, a lot of the things that gets me excited, go and be in the outdoors and go do some big bike ride or big hike. Or I went on a 4-day kayak trip with a couple of my friends this summer, where we just
I remember
everything. We kayaked in and fished and kayaked for a couple. All of those, fun. It was wonderful. And yet, without a certain level of physical capacity, that would be miserable for a lot of people, because it just would have been too physically demanding for it to be enjoyable. And so for me, the daily investment of my time in physical activity is about building and maintaining the systems that are necessary so that I can continue to do all these things that they enjoy. And for me, that's all I need. I like routine. I like building, and I've had enough, I would say, significant setbacks physically. Like I said, I've had 3 knee surgeries, 2 of which I was on crutches for 3 months. I had a bike crash where I broke my shoulder in 4 places, and so I've had some things where I've been forced away from physical activity, and after 1 or 2 of them, I wasn't sure that I would ever get back to a level of function. And so for me, what motivated me, because I had become, relative to my normal behaviors, I'd become quite sedentary. I had a period where I think my average step count was maybe 1,500 or 2,000 steps a day, because any more than that and my knee would give me problems and things. And so that was not the type of person I wanted to be. It wasn't the lifestyle I wanted to lead. It wasn't going to allow me to do the things I wanted to do with my family. We went on a vacation, and I couldn't do a lot of I basically fished in a canoe the whole time because I could sit. Right? And so that was the reality of my situation at the time. So you have to be flexible. And I still enjoyed myself, but it was very difficult to go from that level to get back to being more highly active. And so again, this sort of ties in all these tips that I've been talking about.
I think so.
It was my why, is that I wanted to be the type of person, the type of parent, the type of husband that could still go out and do all of these things. And so I had to very much reimagine what I thought of exercise as being. And so walking to work became my exercise for the day, and that was about as much as it could take. And so you do what your body will take, and then you try to add another victory tomorrow, and so on. And to your earlier point, if you do miss a day, or if you have a little bit of a setback, just win tomorrow.
That's exactly right. Yeah. Win tomorrow. I love how we're closing out on this. It's just think about your why. That would be a big takeaway, I think, for today. It kind of bleeds out into all the rest of the results you can have in your fitness journey. So this is awesome. I'm enjoying this so much. Before we get out of here, how best can the Laughers, if they want to get in touch with you on social media or otherwise, how would they do that, Dr. Saunders?
Well, because I mentioned that I embrace being a contrarian, I have virtually no social media presence whatsoever. So the easiest way to reach me is I can be reached through my professional email, which at JMU, which is saundemj@jmu.edu.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Dr. Saunders. And Laughers will be sure to put that email in the show notes for you. So if you're working out or driving, you can certainly, when you're safe, look up that information and reach out to Mike. And thank you so much, Mike, for coming on the show and sharing a lot of your story I didn't know about. That was fun. And your insights and your tips on fitness. I truly appreciate it. So valuable. Thanks again for coming on the show.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's been a really enjoyable conversation.
Yes, it has. And Laughers, thank you so much for tuning in today. You are so special to me and to what we do here. We can't do anything that we do without you and your support. We cheer you on in a healthier you this year in 2025. We have some more information coming out for you in the series in the next week, so tune in for that. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe this podcast with a friend, maybe one that you're being accountable with, that you want to do group fitness with, or somebody that you really care about and you think this can help them too. Please do share that. And lastly, and most importantly, thanks for tuning in, Laughers. Out of all the podcasts out there, you picked us, and we think that's pretty darn special, just like you. And until next time, keep smiling. Bye.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Virginia is for Laughers podcast, brought to you by the Funny Womack and Friends. We'll be dropping a new podcast every Wednesday, so check back for another uplifting episode. Come to a FWAF show or let us bring one to you. To find out more, head to thefunnywomacks.com. Be sure to share this podcast with a friend, and until next time, cheers.